Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Karina, and I'm joined today by Dr. Colin Ross. He's an author and psychiatrist out of Dallas, Texas, and he's a leading expert on CIA mind control experiments. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure to be here.
So today we want to talk about interrogation techniques and what interrogation techniques might have to do with brainwashing. Are they one and the same? Are they still used today?
Well, brainwashing and interrogation kind of overlap. I think the best way to look at it is to imagine that it's on a spectrum. So at this end of the spectrum, somebody's brought into the police station. It's a little bit of an intimidating environment. They're put in a room. There's people with guns walking around, and you're not sure how long that's going to last. But it's just 15, 30 minutes of pretty straightforward questioning, and then you're released. So that's an interrogation, but obviously not brainwashing.
Right.
But what happens is you just add a little more, a little more, a little more, a little more, and then you get out at full brainwashing. So you might add, instead of a half hour, it's a 12-hour interrogation, and a bunch of different people come in and out, and there's a good cop, bad cop technique that gets used. You're in a bright room, your sleep is disturbed, you're not fed, you can't go to the restroom for prolonged periods. There's maybe some veiled threats about if you don't talk, here's what's going to happen. You're not allowed to call a lawyer. And this is all trying to soften you up and get the information out. But then the next day you go home. So that's a slightly enhanced interrogation, but it's just normal police work. And it's not a human rights violation. But then you jump to, you're suddenly captured in the Middle East, you're hooded, you're put on a unmarked jet, next thing you know, you're at Guantanamo Bay. You're in solitary confinement, you have food deprivation, sleep deprivation, there's bright lights at night, there's all kinds of raunchy rock music being played, there's hoodings, there's forced positions where you have to stay in a very awkward, very painful position, like against the wall, crouched down for hours on end. You're threatened with dogs, which are really scary, vicious dogs. You're going to have mock executions that happen. And then there's the kind of sexual part of it where your religion is ridiculed, your beliefs about sexuality are ridiculed, your body is ridiculed. And as we see in the Abu Ghraib photos, you're forced to pose in mock sexual acts with other naked prisoners. There's U.S. females looking at you, mocking you. So that's in a whole, and there's drugs, hallucinogens involved. So that's way up at the other end of the spectrum, which is obviously much more than just a police interrogation.
Right.
So enhanced interrogations are kind of normal interrogations with a whole lot of brainwashing techniques added on.
Right, so they give him that really nice name, enhanced, but really what an enhanced interrogation techniques is just throwing in some of those brainwashing things. Can you tell us in detail about some of these brainwashing techniques?
Well, what we know from the public domain information that's come out from Abu Ghraib and from Guantanamo Bay is that, first of all, these are actual operations. They're not just a few random people. The cover story for Abu Ghraib was just a few out-of-control, low-down people. But clearly, Seymour Hersh reported that there's actual code name for the Abu Ghraib interrogation program. At Guantanamo Bay, there's a behavioral science consultation team that's responsible for monitoring, participating in the interrogations. So there's psychologists, psychiatrists directly involved.
Wow. And
there's a whole chain of command about it. There's manuals for it, there's training about it, there's techniques, which go back to the School of the Americas and other similar organizations, 90s, 80s, 70s, where there's actual public domain manuals of how to do enhanced interrogation in the military, which in turn goes back to Bluebird, Artichoke, MK Ultra. So it's a clear, line of technique development. We know at Guantanamo Bay that they use all these different techniques: hooding, life threats, dogs, sexual humiliation, ridicule of their religion, food deprivation. So it's a whole assembly of different techniques, plus a variety of different drugs.
Wow, so what are the ethics involved in having psychiatrists and psychologists directly involved in something that has nothing to do with people's mental health, but is clearly for the purpose of developing these interrogation techniques?
Well, just in the last few years, less than 5 years, the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association have just started to publicly discuss this and take a position on it. Before that, there was absolutely no comment from the professional associations whatsoever. In my view, it's absolutely miles beyond any kind of border of medical ethics or decent human behavior by a physician. Mm-hmm. Clearly, if you did that in a hospital in the United States to a civilian person, it would be wild malpractice. You'd probably lose your license.
Wow.
And just because it's in a military setting, and just because it's over in Cuba or over at Abu Ghraib, doesn't change anything from a medical ethics point of view.
Wow. So, we talked in previous videos more specifically about MK Ultra, but it's really interesting to think that, really what's going on now is just kind of a continuation of very much the same intentions that were going on back then, trying to develop these interrogation techniques, looking at erasing memories, looking at dragging information out of people. So, where do you think this could potentially go? Do you think that there's a chance that the ethics of this situation are going to really, bring the hammer down on it and really be able to terminate things like this from happening? Or is this something that's likely going to continue well into the future?
Well, I think there's kind of several steps that have occurred over the last half century. If we go back 50, 60 years, a lot of this was contracted at the mainstream universities, and the contractors were leading professors who had regular civilian grants, published in journals, edited journals, were the leaders of the field. Mm-hmm. And it looks like, I can't prove this, but it looks like it's pretty well been shifted out of academia into the private sector. Mm-hmm. So non-lethal weapons, which are microwave and ultrasound type weapons, all the development of those, the contracting, the engineering seems to be done largely outside academia in private corporations. Much like Blackwater and other firms, and now are handling a lot of the operations in the Middle East. So there's been the whole move to privatization, which also makes it easier to clamp down and keep, off the books.
Right, keep it more classified and more hidden.
So I think in response to public pressure about the ethics of it, what we're going to see is moving it further out of the hands of medical people, moving it out of academia, and really increasing the intensity of the security oath. And so it'll be more kind of off the books and more hidden.
Wow. So that makes everyone more safe if this kind of thing is being more hidden. What are some other areas in our lives, in our day-to-day lives, where brainwashing techniques might be being used, or where we might be exposed to certain brainwashing techniques?
Well, when you talk about just the general populace being exposed to brainwashing techniques, you're back in the sort of the low end of everyday brainwashing, where this company is trying to brainwash you to buy their product.
Right.
So calling that brainwashing kind of makes the whole thing sound sort of silly. But clearly that's going on all the time.
Right.
Clearly, hundreds of thousands of citizens are not getting pulled off the street and sent to Guantanamo Bay in the United States every year. So the number of people who could be getting snatched and actually worked on because they're dissidents or radicals or saying something about the state, it can't very well be millions. It can't be hundreds of thousands. I doubt if it's zero, though.
Interesting.
And then the whole other area that I get a lot of correspondence about is people who think that they are being harassed with electromagnetic weapons. And there's thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people around the world who claim that's happening to them. But of course the problem is you can't prove it or disprove it.
Right.
But that's a growing issue, and you can find people on the internet who've organized, and you can see draft legislation. What are the standards for monitoring these kind of weapons?
Right.
Which clearly exist in reality.
Interesting. And especially looking at, the MK Ultra experiments again as an example, we had something that was completely classified, and then you fast forward a little bit and now everyone, a lot of those documents were destroyed, but a lot of those documents ended up being released. So in a situation where we know that there's more of this classified work being done, things that we don't know about, it is interesting that possibilities could kind of run wild, what we might know 50 years down the road from now.
Well, if you just look at what we do with our cell phones today compared to what we do with our phones 30 years ago, and we know the curve is going like this, and we know it's the same thing with weapons, spy satellites kind of development, eavesdropping. Who knows where it's going to be 20, 30 years from now?
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit more about this microwave or radiation techniques?
Going back into the MKUltra, there was sub-projects describing beaming various kinds of energy at monkeys to see how it affected their behavior and their state of consciousness. So this technology has been in development at least 60 years now. And there's a U.S. News and World Report article early in the 21st century describing an Air Force aircraft which is holding one of these pieces of equipment. The contractor was Sandia Labs in New Mexico. It describes the specs of the weapon. It describes the altitude of the plane, how far away the target is, and how far into the person's skin the electromagnetic beam penetrates, and what its effects are on a person's behavior. Wow. So these weapons absolutely for a fact exist, and they can make you nauseous, make you disoriented, induce pain, or knock you out. They're non-lethal because they don't kill you. So first of all, there's no doubt these weapons exist.
Wow.
In terms of are civilians actually being experimented on without their knowledge and consent? That sounds fantastic and ridiculous until you go back to the history. And the history, totally documented, includes LSD experiments on unwitting civilians, various kinds of chemical and biological weapons, things being released in the subway system in New York, in the Bay Area and San Francisco, people being injected with plutonium without their knowledge or consent. All of this is completely documented. And also large clouds of radioactive material being released over civilian populations to see the wind dispersal patterns. So since all of those experiments for a fact have happened in reality, why would we go, well,
there's no way that
no way with non-lethal weapons. So it's, to me, plausible. I don't know for a fact it's going on. And, dozens and dozens of people write me or email me about this. Some of the people who email me obviously are highly mentally disturbed and their thought processes don't add up or make sense at all. And others are very coherent, very normal sounding, have very plausible stories, and even accounts of who the people are who have military connections who dragged them into this.
Right.
So basically I would say I doubt that 100% of it's real, and I doubt that 0% is real.
Wow.
That's really all I can say on it.
Interesting. But, and you bring up a really interesting point that, clearly there was experimentation being done on involuntary subjects previously. So why would we think that couldn't be happening now? And especially that as many of these people may come forward and tell their story, so many of these stories are just so absolutely absurd that they just get written off as being mental or
well, it's really a perfect kind of cover. If you want to test these kind of weapons on unwitting civilians, they're just the people with the tinfoil helmets on. Basically, they sound completely crazy. They're totally easy to discredit. Nobody believes it. And so you can kind of experiment with impunity. So my basic comment for the profession of psychiatry is, what I think psychiatrists should do is not automatically say this is delusional. They should at least consider the possibility that some percentage of this could be real and not automatically go psychosis, delusional, medication.
Right. So if somebody wanted to learn more about this, is there a reference you could give them, or do you have something that you have published on this subject?
I do, actually. My book, The CIA Doctors, which you can get through Amazon or my website, includes a chapter on non-lethal weapons, plus all of this background information about interrogation, mind control.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. We will be in future videos discussing more about biological psychiatry and especially the role of psychiatrists in some of these experiments. So please subscribe to the channel, Please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends if you enjoyed it. Be sure to friend Psyche Truth on the Facebook, and we'll see you guys next time.